Charles Ponzi, the man who believed his own lie. Chapter 1, The Choice. In January 1920, a man sitting in a small office on School Street in Boston made a decision that would cost 40,000 people everything they had. His name was Charles Ponzi, and the decision took about as long as it takes to count $1,770. That was the money his first agent, Ettore Ghiberti, had collected from 18 investors. Ponzi looked at it. He had run the numbers before Ghiberti walked in. He knew that the arbitrage opportunity he had been selling, buying international postal reply coupons cheaply in countries with weak currencies and redeeming them at higher value in the United States, was real in theory and impossible in practice. The entire world had approximately 27,000 of these coupons in circulation. To honor his commitments to these 18 investors alone, he needed 53,000. The coupons did not exist. The returns could not be paid. The business was over before it had properly begun. He also knew something that is harder to explain but more important to understand. He was 37 years old. He had been promising himself and everyone around him that the moment was coming for nearly 2 decades. He had a wife who believed in him. He had a story he had been telling himself since he stepped off the boat in Boston with $2.50 in his pocket. And now he had $1,770 on the table in front of him, and 18 people who believed the story too. Returning the money meant admitting the story was wrong. Not just the coupon arbitrage, the whole story. The one about the immigrant who was going to make it, the one Rose had married, the one his mother had crossed an ocean to see fulfilled. He had 2 choices. He could return the money and admit it was over, or he could say nothing, pay the first investors with the next investors' money, and keep going until something changed. He kept going. To understand why, you need to know 2 things about Charles Ponzi. The first is where he came from. The second is what he saw in Montreal in 1907. He arrived in Boston in 1903 with $2.50 and the kind of ambition that has no patience for the distance between wanting something and having it. He spent the next 17 years cycling through menial jobs, minor frauds, and 2 prison sentences. One in Canada for forgery, one in Atlanta for smuggling illegal immigrants across the border. By 1919, he was 37 years old, broke, and had spent more of his adult life in prison than out of it. Then he found the coupons, and for a brief moment, the arbitrage was genuine. Post-war currency collapses meant $1 could buy enough Italian lira to purchase 66 coupons in Italy, which could be redeemed in America for $3.30 worth of stamps. A real opportunity, a real number. The problem was the stamps. You could not convert stamps into cash at scale. The margins were thin. The administrative burden was enormous. The coupons simply did not exist in sufficient numbers. Ponzi knew all of this when Ghiberti put $1,770 on the table. He also knew something else. 13 years earlier, in 1907, Ponzi had arrived in Montreal broke and taken a job as a junior clerk at Banco Zarossi, a small bank serving the Italian immigrant community. His boss was Luigi Zarossi, a charming and well-dressed man who had built the bank's reputation by offering depositors 6% interest on their savings, double the market rate. The immigrants trusted him because he was one of them and because the number was real. The money arrived every month exactly as promised. What the depositors did not know was where the money was coming from. Zarossi was not generating returns. He was taking the remittance money that immigrant workers had saved to send home to their families in Italy and using it to fund the interest payments to his depositors. He was robbing one group of Italians to pay another group of Italians and staying one step ahead of the gap by keeping both groups from ever comparing notes. Ponzi watched this from close enough to understand exactly how it worked. He saw how Zarossi managed the confidence, how he dressed, how he spoke to people, how the performance of certainty was more important than the reality underneath it. He also watched Zarossi's bank eventually collapse when the gap became too wide to bridge. And he watched Zarossi disappear to Mexico one step ahead of the consequences. Ponzi filed all of it away. When the $1,770 arrived in January 1920, he did not stumble into fraud. He remembered Montreal. Chapter 2. The Performance. The money did not trickle in. It arrived. Within weeks of opening the Securities Exchange Company on School Street, Ponzi had more investors than his office could process. Clerks dumped cash into wire baskets to be sorted later. His 18-year-old bookkeeper, Lucy Melly, managed the records on index cards because there were no ledgers, no adding machines, and no system that could keep pace with what was happening. A former cellmate of Ponzi's named Louis Casulo was responsible for depositing the cash. He was also quietly stealing some of it. Ponzi either did not notice or did not care. By May 1920, he had privately accepted what he had known since January. There was no arbitrage operation. There never had been. He was paying early investors with late investors' money, and the gap between what he owed and what he had was widening every week. What he did next is the part that is hardest to explain and most important to understand. He did not slow down, he accelerated. He opened satellite offices across New England. He hired agents on commission and paid them well enough that they had every reason to keep recruiting. He gave interviews. He held press conferences. He told anyone who would listen that he had discovered a financial method so powerful that the banks were conspiring against him because they were afraid. He said it with the calm of a man who had already won. The performance was so complete that the people watching it began to perform alongside him. Journalists wrote admiringly. Investors recruited their neighbors. A city that prided itself on financial conservatism handed its money to an Italian immigrant with 2 prison sentences and no verifiable business because he made it feel like the opportunity of a lifetime. The question is whether Ponzi believed any of it by then. The answer is that it probably did not matter. He had been performing his whole life. The difference between belief and performance had never been clear to him. What was clear was the feeling. The mansion in Lexington, the yellow stucco house on Slocum Road with imported furniture and a private limousine, the gold-handled cane. His mother brought over from Italy, Rose in a home that finally matched the life he had always told her was coming. That feeling was real even if nothing else was. And as long as the money kept arriving, he could keep the feeling alive. Working-class immigrants who had saved for years handed over everything they had. Doctors and lawyers who should have known better handed over more. Approximately 75% of the Boston police force invested. The city's financial establishment watched this man take their depositors and could do nothing about it. Then Clarence Barron started asking questions. Barron was the most respected financial journalist in America. He looked at Ponzi's operation and did something simple. He did the arithmetic. For Ponzi's claimed returns to be legitimate, 160 million international reply coupons would need to exist. The U.S. Post Office confirmed that approximately 27,000 were in circulation worldwide. Barron also noted that if Ponzi had genuinely found a method to double money in 90 days, he would not be holding his personal savings in standard 5% government bonds, which he was. Ponzi's response was immediate. He called a press conference and announced that Clarence Barron had forgotten more about foreign exchange than he would ever know. Then he filed a $5 million libel suit to silence him. He had no answer to the arithmetic, so he attacked the man who had done it. In July 1920, needing to manage the volume of press attention the Barron story had generated, Ponzi hired a publicist. His name was William McMasters, a former reporter for the Boston Post. McMasters arrived at the School Street office and started watching. What he found was not a fraudster covering his tracks. It was something stranger. There were no tracks to cover because there had never been any attempt to create them. The wire baskets of unsorted cash were not hidden. The index card filing system was not disguised as something more sophisticated. There were no records of actual coupon trading because the thought of maintaining that fiction in paperwork had apparently never occurred to Ponzi. The office looked exactly like what it was, a man collecting money faster than anyone could count it and paying earlier collectors with later collections. McMasters asked questions. The answers contradicted each other. He asked again. Ponzi smiled and changed the subject. After 2 weeks, McMasters made his decision. He went to the Boston Post and sold his inside account for $5,000 and a $1,000 bonus. He had been hired to protect Ponzi's image. He had spent 2 weeks watching a man with no image left to protect. On the morning of Sunday, August 1st, 1920, McMasters signed the contract. On Monday, August 2nd, the Boston Post ran his account on the front page. Ponzi, hopelessly insolvent. That same morning, before Ponzi had seen the paper, Rose told him something she had been holding for 2 years. She had known about his criminal past before they married. His mother had written to her with the full account. 2 prison sentences, the forgery in Montreal, the smuggling conviction in Atlanta. Rose had read the letter, understood exactly what it meant, and chosen to say nothing. She had walked into the marriage with her eyes open. She had stood beside him through the scheme's rise, watched the mansion arrive and the crowds form, and the city turn his name into a symbol of impossible returns. And she had said nothing. She had protected his ego for 2 years, because she understood, perhaps better than anyone, the distance between who Charles Ponzi was and who he needed to believe he was. She chose to tell him on the morning the rest of the world was about to close that distance for him. There is no record of what he said in response. There is no account of what passed between them in that room before he picked up his jacket and his cane and walked out the door. What is known is that by the time he reached School Street, Rose was speaking to reporters on the front step of the Lexington mansion and calling him her ideal. She had spent 2 years holding his story together from the inside. She held it together for one more day. Ponzi arrived at School Street to find the glass doors of his office shattered. The crowd stretched around the block. Thousands of investors had read the morning paper and wanted their money. The noise was extraordinary. He straightened his jacket. He picked up his cane. He walked into the building and ordered coffee and donuts for the crowd. For the rest of that day, he moved through the mob with a smile that witnesses described as a mill pond. Calm, unhurried. His clerks paid out claims as fast as they could to project the image of total solvency. Ponzi shook hands. He made jokes. He told anyone who would listen that the Post was lying and that the business was sound. He had $4 million in assets against $7 million in liabilities. He smiled anyway. It was the finest performance of his life, and like everything else he had built, it was already over. Chapter 3. The Arithmetic. The audit took 8 days. Edwin Pride, the accountant appointed by the court, went through what records existed: index cards, wire baskets, deposit slips. What he found was simple. Ponzi had approximately $4 million in assets against liabilities of roughly $7 million. He was $3 million short of solvency and had been for months. On August 12, 1920, Charles Ponzi surrendered to federal authorities. Charged with mail fraud, he served 3.5 years in federal prison, then fought extradition to Massachusetts for years before serving additional time in state prison for larceny. He was never a U.S. citizen. In 1934, he was deported to Italy as an undesirable alien. Rose stayed as long as she could, through the trials, through the appeals, through a brief and disastrous attempt at a Florida real estate scheme between prison sentences that fooled no one. When he was deported, she could not follow him. She had no means of supporting herself in a country where he had no income and no prospects. She filed for divorce in 1937. They kept writing to each other anyway, affectionate letters until he died. She remarried in 1956. She worked as a bookkeeper at a racetrack. She lived to 97. A man named Fiore Bevilacqua, known as Frank Drinkwater, handed Ponzi his life savings, $10,000. He got back $3,750. 20,000 victims were compensated through the bankruptcy proceedings. They received 37.5 cents on every dollar they had lost, paid in small installments every December for 10 years. In 1948, in a charity ward in Rio de Janeiro, partially paralyzed and nearly blind, Charles Ponzi gave his final interview. He was asked about the scheme. He said, "My business was simple. It was the old game of robbing Peter to pay Paul." He died on January 17, 1949. His estate was worth $75. He had spent his life unable to tell where the belief ended and the fraud began. At the end, with nothing left to protect, the answer turned out to be simple. It always had been.